Hey there. Welcome to the Pelvis Project podcast. I'm Megan.
And I'm Roxy. We're two pelvic health experts brought together by passion for our careers, entrepreneurship, motherhood, and the desire for intentional relationships.
Join us in our mission to spread pelvic floor awareness and start conversations surrounding the truth behind genuine health, imperfect wellness, and joyfully navigating life. We are so glad you are here with us.
Let's start the conversation.
Good evening, Roxy.
Good evening, Megan. How are you?
I'm pretty good. We are gearing up for back to school. So are you.
Uh-huh.
Lots of big changes. So, all right. Well, first we have to start with tell me something good.
My girls on Friday night went to a little sleepover with Grandma, and it was just so nice.
Aw.
We went on a date night, and the next morning, some friends and I did an early morning kayak.
Oh, nice.
And just did a few things that were good for me. And I don't know, not just me, but like Austin and I, obviously. But like, he was like started a little project that just for fun. You know, it was one of those where we love our kids, but man, it was just refreshing to
good.
remember like, oh, I thought, what do I not do on Saturday mornings anymore? Because like,
Yes.
So just, I don't know, was just a high point for me that felt so good. And to have a little self-care and not feel guilty about it and all the things.
And I don't think we've shared with our listeners yet, but things are about to change for you. So why don't you share that?
Well, there's a third little nugget that's going to be here in like 3 weeks. Give or take a few.
Roxy's been pregnant. We haven't talked about it, but we're going to wait for her to have her little third baby. And then we'll do some episodes on her postpartum recovery. So it's going to be so sweet. So we're excited for Roxy.
Thank you.
Yes. Okay, let's see. I don't know. I feel like Sunday we were prepping for some back to school stuff and it just felt really good. Just getting my son involved and having him, we got school supplies ready and got his room all cleaned up and his uniforms out. And we sat and ate lunch together and talked about like what we want the date, how we want the morning to go and after school to go. And he was like so involved in it and really was like into it. And so it felt really good to have just like that involvement. And even though I was also feeling extremely tired that day, because maybe we'll say this for another episode, but I started progesterone and my second night of it, let me tell you, everybody, you better take that and go to sleep. So I'm going to keep on that. I was day 2, and then I'm not going to lie, I stopped it because I'm waiting for a lower dose. So let's save this conversation about me starting progesterone for a whole episode. Because it's, anyway.
I'm just glad you're going through that first.
Oh,
so
gosh. Well,
thanks for being the pioneer of our friendship in that way.
Starting HRT, and I can tell you all about it.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we're going to talk a little bit tonight about hips, actually, and kind of a little bit more of an orthopedic lens and how often when you have hip problems, you don't really think to go see a pelvic floor therapist, but kind of how they're intertwined and why we love seeing people with hip issues and kind of maybe some little nuances that you don't think about between the two. So Roxy's going to start, and this kind of came into her clinic here recently and it spurred some conversation. And so we'll dive in.
Yeah. I think it just is on my radar right now because of a recent patient, but there's been several patients that I just hear like, man, I'm so tight, or I have this kind of nagging pain, but I've always been stiff. I feel like I used to be flexible, or I stretch every single day, or I get a massage every week or every 2 weeks, but my hips are just always tight. That's just how my body is. And I'm really thinking about, we're going to dive into just why we can really help, and we do really help. But it just is, that thought of, man, there can be pelvic floor dysfunction happening in the midst of the primary symptom being hip pain.
Yeah.
And there can actually be like, this patient that I'm thinking of has no pelvic floor, just like symptoms, I should say. But obviously that we're going to get into, but the pelvic floor is also affected by this. And so as pelvic health therapists, we're a great option and we see good results with this because we don't just treat the hip. So,
Yeah, and just from even from just seeing what we see clinically, and I will have, kind of to what Roxy just said, people that will say, they might be coming in for maybe something completely different. And they'll mention, and sometimes too, I see people that come in that don't necessarily have any pelvic floor dysfunction, but really just want a good kind of like full body approach, body work done, making sure that like they are proactive in monitoring their pelvic health, especially kind of this perimenopause, menopause stage, which I really love seeing because a lot of us in this age category weren't educated well. And so I love educating people and being able to help them learn about their bodies. But anyway, I've had a handful of people where, we do the pelvic floor assessment and we do a little bit of pelvic floor release work. And there's not necessarily a ton of like symptoms they're having pelvic floor. But one thing they'll say is like, I just always feel like my hips get stuck or they feel really tight. And so we'll do the pelvic floor work. And I've had people stand up afterwards before and just say like, oh my gosh, like, whoa, I almost feel like unsteady because like I've never felt so much mobility through my hips. And I think that that's just a really cool piece. It kind of goes with tailbone pain, how often pelvic floor providers get a bit overlooked as to we're the people to send to because that's right in our wheelhouse. Kind of a similar thing with the hips. So anyway, I think that with this episode, we're just going to kind of explore the connection between hip mobility, pelvic floor function, and overall movement. So we know in research that limited hip range of motion can alter the pelvic mechanics and load on pelvic floor muscles. And what's really cool is we're seeing more and more about how like even looking at foot and ankle mobility and all of that, how that can affect how the pelvic floor is functioning. So, and the hip is, man, might as well be cousins. So chronic hip tightness can be linked to overactive pelvic floor muscles, compensation and gait or lifting mechanics, core instability. We think about the pelvic floor and the hips. The hip muscles share fascial and neural connections. And so one muscle in particular is the obturator internus, and it's a key bridge muscle between the pelvic floor and the hips. And so that's kind of one of the specific muscles that we really can hone in on when you're seeing a pelvic floor provider, when you're having this kind of chronic deep hip tightness, is that OI. And there's ways to release it externally. It's just not as aggressive. And that's where kind of that really good money spot is. And we also see that if someone has an overactive pelvic floor, it can be because the hips are weak. It can be because the hips are tight. And so that's our job as we're kind of unwinding the layers and figuring that out. I mean, we also know that tight muscles can be weak muscles and that whole slew of events. But yeah, I really think it's so cool when he starts looking about like the bridging of between the muscles.
I think about just really, we've talked about this with just the pelvic floor anatomy and how the pelvis is a big junction in general between the top half of our body and the bottom half of our body. And so this is no different in the sense of like, we need the core, like the trunk and the pelvis to work together to build a good foundation for then the hips to work off of. And so just as you're talking about like, that's a bridge muscle and whatnot, and that's like where we geek out and we nerd out is because the pelvic floor is kind of like a bridge between the top
It
half of our
is.
body and the lower half of our body. And so then when we're talking about the hip, it gets even more exciting to say, oh my goodness, like this makes sense. And it really applies to just what we're good at and what we know and how we see things. And so that's why we wanted to, just to kind of really affirm what you're saying, I guess, and just even try to continue to make those connections of saying, man, there's so many connections there that we see, like Megan, like you said, of just, we sometimes get overlooked in the sense of we can only work on the pelvic floor. We can only work on
Uh-huh.
bladder and bowel symptoms and all the things. And it's like, oh gosh, no, like we are PTs first, and
Uh-huh.
so we have all these skills. We're able to make those connections maybe at a deeper level than someone who doesn't have as deep of a perspective in the pelvic floor as we do, because it is such a big bridge. So
I think I saw the APTA, somebody had given me like a sticker or a thing, and it was for pelvic health, and it had on it, it's like orthopedics, but in a cave or something like that. It was like
Uh-huh.
ortho in a cave. And I thought that was just really clever because, I mean, I think we forget how much of what we're doing is orthopedic,
Uh-huh.
but you're right. People just, it just doesn't get like connected. They're like, oh, can
Yeah.
I come see if I have hip pain? I'm like, yeah. Can I come see if I have back pain? Yeah. Like,
Please
we're
do.
people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, I'll kind of keep this rolling though. As far as just as Megan was talking about those bridges, and so we look at when there's so many connecting pieces together, then there's a lot of overlap between like the symptoms that we see. And so some common symptoms that we're going to see that really tip us off, especially as pelvic health therapists. We will see this with pelvic floor specific patients, but these are also being seen in people maybe that don't have pelvic floor symptoms. So like hip pinching with squats or stairs, where when we get into a certain depth, that hurts. And so then, like Megan talked about just a little bit ago, then we would end up seeing compensations in the range that the hip is going through. And when we see that, then we don't have as good a function. If we're limited in our mobility because the body is anticipating that pain and that depth, then we start to see that hip pinching happening, and then that limits our mobility. Also, just discomfort with sitting, where people maybe can do their workout or they can go through their day or they can do all the things, not have a ton of pain, but they sit or they lay down at night. That's when like their ache sets in their hips. Deep buttock pain. And so this can often, people will just kind of blanket statement this as piriformis,
Yeah.
but that deep pain in the butt, we forget that the piriformis is a hip muscle, and there's a whole bunch more that go along with it that are in there along with the pelvic floor. And so like piriformis is just kind of like the umbrella term. I mean, it is a muscle and can be very valid, but a lot of times we're like just saying, oh, let's just do this with this one hip muscle. We're overlooking all the other connections there that can be contributing or causing that pain. Some other symptoms here then that we also see is urinary urgency frequency. Megan talked about that overactive pelvic floor. What happens when we have an overactive pelvic floor? We are seeing there's symptoms that happen in the hip, but then that's also causing more dysfunction, and it's fueling symptoms with urinary, bowel, all those types of things. Another one is pain with intercourse, like if those hips are tight.
Uh-huh.
And that could even be like positionally putting the hips in a position of stretch or, certain positions during intimacy of just those positions can be uncomfortable. But also if the hips are tight, then the pelvic floor a lot of times has some type of mobility impairment. And so then, I mean, it's like poking a bear literally at that point. But then just really even thinking about continuing on, like, why does this happen? Or how would a tight hip, why would these tight hip joints, why would they cause this pelvic floor? Like, how does that even work? And so we just think about if the hips are tight, then we are not allowing good mobility. And then when we're stiff, then those muscles are tight and that increases the resting tone. So what that means is basically like, or if you're laying down, for example, then those muscles are going to stay tight when they should be just fully relaxed, like your body should when you're laying down. That would be your resting tone. And so there's a higher resting tone. And when those muscles are tight, then we don't have good blood flow. We don't have good oxygenation. You think about when you're stiff, we would associate that with cold. And when you're mobile and flexible, we associate that with warm, right? And so we would just think about those different verbiages that we would use in any other
Mhm.
part of our body that's still applicable to the pelvic floor. And so if the hips are tight, we can a lot of times assume that the pelvic floor then has a level of mobility impairment. And if it's not mobile, it's not getting that blood flow. So just as an example then, and we also think of like the hips as only being the butt or the sides, right? But just an example is that like our inner thighs are actually hip muscles as well. If we have a tight groin or tightness in those inner thighs, then that kind of tugs on the pelvic floor. There's a lot of fascial connection, like we talked about earlier, between the pelvic floor and the hip muscles. And so if like your groin's tight or your inner thighs are tight, that pulls on the pelvic floor muscles. Well, when they're being pulled on, then they don't relax well, right? Like
Uh-huh.
if there's tension on a muscle that's right next door to another muscle, that always is going to influence. Our body doesn't work in isolation. One muscle can't be perfectly healthy, in my opinion. Might be a bold statement, but in my opinion, you can't have a perfectly healthy muscle right next door neighbors with a muscle that's very impaired. Just because
Uh-huh.
of those fascial connections, that there's,
Uh-huh.
if one is driving it, if one is really tight or one is injured or whatever, it's, in my opinion, always going to have that influence on the muscle right next door because of that fascial network. And so that's how we see this. The hip muscles are next door neighbors with the pelvic floor muscles. And so if the hips are tight, then that's always going to cause a level of pelvic floor dysfunction, whether that's symptomatic or not.
Yep. That's so good. I would also say, okay, so I'm going to circle back to the deep buttock pain,
Yeah.
how often it gets thrown in that it's like piriformis syndrome,
Mm-hmm.
or whatnot. And I will say, when you talked about, piriformis is right there, basically it's right next to pelvic floor muscles. I think I've seen in some literature that piriformis is listed as a pelvic floor muscle, but it's like not always, but sometimes is.
Yeah, I think it's kind of gray area.
It is. I know. I think in one of the courses they're like, and if you have a long enough digit, I think it was like was
You
it the
can
rectal course or something?
palpate
You
the
can palpate it, the
piriformis. I'm like,
piriformis. So I was like, woo, I don't think so. But
yeah.
besides the point, I can't. Or I don't know. Maybe I haven't. I didn't realize it. So, but anyway, I was thinking about how so often you have somebody who like reports like a piriformis type pain, but then when we're doing internal work, we are releasing the posterior pelvic floor, and they're like, "That's my pain." Or
Mm.
not
Uh-huh.
necessarily on the piriformis. And then how I love to be able to show them when I'm internal, I'll press, but then I'll take my external hand and I'll go on the outside of the buttock and I'll be like, okay, on the outside, this is where I am. And I'll do a little kind of like back and forth motion from internal, internal, external, so they can feel that it's that stack. And they're like, yep, that's it, you know? And here, if we would have been just like pounding the piriformis, we're
Mm-hmm.
missing a group of muscles. And the piriformis could have something to do with it, but it's just to the point that sometimes it's just like, what's the saying? And the objects may appear bigger than whatever.
Larger than they actually are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But like, it's just things can appear differently. And
Mm-hmm.
so, and then to that with the adductors, I think also too, as women, like we haven't been taught, we don't know, and sometimes we don't even literally even think two symptoms have anything to do with each other. So if you have this like happen to have some bladder symptoms, but you just are kind of like, oh well, this has just been me, and then you have these really tight adductors, and then you start having reported as hip stuff. It's like knowing how much the adductors influence bladder is huge. And I know, I used to not spend much time on adductor work until I got enlightened. And I think it was you, Roxy. I think one time we talked about what our favorite muscle was, and you said it was the adductors.
Mm.
I think I said diaphragm, and you said
Yeah.
adductors. I don't know how I remember that. Yeah, it really got me kind of like thinking. And I mean, it's pretty amazing, when you start to palpate and do some tissue work through the adductors, what people report and how tender, I mean, how much it needs to be done. And I just love that piece of it in the whole system. And yeah, when you think about, I love what you said about, yeah, to have like a healthy muscle next to a muscle that's, having some major dysfunction or not, or injured, that it's going to affect everything around it. So I think just that image too is like, for sure,
Mm.
I would have to agree with that. So, but yeah, I just feel like it's really cool stuff that we are able to kind of take a look at a little bit deeper. And then, so, it's like you come in for your hip. We're also looking, okay, pelvic floor, we're working adductors. We're also going to be looking up the abdominal wall, your rib cage, because it's a whole system. And also down, I mean, I've been looking more and more now at ankle and foot mobility. And does the foot rigid? Does the big toe move? Like, it is a whole thing, but it's like fun and exciting to see, because ultimately when you start moving these things and strengthening correctly, you can see it's just people come alive again, and being able to have better outcomes even in their sport. Cause I've got a patient right now who is very active and plays adult like volleyball and softball and all of that. And it's important to her. She was a college athlete, and she's competitive. And so she wants to do well. And so to be able to look at this stuff is empowering to her, to know that she can improve. So let's go into now why stretching alone doesn't fix the problem. So we know that research shows that passive stretching has short-term range of motion gains, but limited long-term change without motor control retraining. So that means strengthening. So yes, it's like in the short term, and believe me, we all give stretches, but it's the more of this like blood flow, mobility flow, because that's not going to do any harm. But we have to start strengthening at some point because that's where the long-term improvement is going to come. In fact, I was just talking to a patient about this today. So we know that tightness is often due to, it can be, there's multiple reasons, but it could be protective guarding or poor load distribution and not necessarily true shortness. So it could be, it's like weakness or protective guarding or, stuff like that. It's not necessarily that the muscle itself is shortened. And then the nervous system plays a major role that we have to keep in mind too. So muscle tone may be upregulated because of pain, instability, or a previous injury. So again, it's not always how it appears. And this is why it's important to evaluate the person in front of you and challenge maybe the way that we're thinking as physical therapists of what maybe we've seen before, and not just be like, oh, yeah, it's this, so I'm going to give this stretch or this strengthening exercise, because there could be lots of reasons why what's going on is going on. So we have to look at all of those things.
Yeah, I always think about too, like just how many people, like it does make sense in our brain, just as if something's tight, let's stretch it, and that should fix it. But I always think too, if we're gonna, anytime we increase range, if we don't teach that new range how to be strong and stable, our body's gonna jump back to just what's comfortable and safe, and that's usually tight and short because that's close to the body. There's low risk there. And thinking about the nervous system, then the muscle memory, the brain is saying, stay here close. Like, don't do a bigger movement because we can't count on you or, you to stabilize. We can't count on these muscles to work because they never go that far out. They don't venture that, far as just through that range. I feel like just even with the couple of hip patients I've had lately is it's really having that conversation of saying, yeah, we do want, like, stretching is good, but it's kind of like part like one, or it's just like, it's one piece of a 2-part puzzle of saying we can stretch or we can increase that mobility, but then we have to teach the body how to use that in a strong way and give the body confidence in that. Yeah, like you said, we're not coming against stretching, but when that's the only piece, then we just see like this poor management of, not even management, but it just is a short-term
optimal
gains. Yeah, it's short-term. It feels good in the moment. It maybe feels good that day, but we're waking up the next morning and we're not getting to the root of the problem, which is like what we're trying to do, which is what we advocate for.
Yeah. And I know, we have people come in that lift every day that are strong individuals. And we know that like, that's not necessarily the problem. Yeah. I've had people where like it swings way the other direction where all they're doing is strengthening and they never stretch. Like their whole body they're like, yeah, I never do. And sometimes it's just a matter of getting a few things in to like produce that balance within the system. And that's when everything starts to take off. It really is fascinating. And being able to have the space and the time to also like dig in a little bit to like, what's their day like and what's their stress level like and all those different factors that we can adjust and we're not necessarily having to throw 50,000 things at this. Sometimes it's well, I don't really like to get more than 3 things anyway, but that's a whole nother conversation. So,
okay.
So anyway, but yeah, I just think the dynamics of all the different ways that this can present is really kind of interesting. And if anything, hopefully after listening to this, you can kind of just like, ponder it and be like, that's interesting. So that if you have a friend or yourself that says like, man, my hips have been bothering me, that, it's like, oh yeah, think a pelvic health therapist of being able to maybe get a little bit more of a deeper dive. And if you're somebody who has had chronic hip pain and you've tried therapy in the past and it only improved a little bit, this could be part of a piece that potentially could be missing also. Something to remember.
Alrighty. That's all.
All right.
That's our soapbox on hip pain.
That's our
Come
soapbox.
see us. Come find a pelvic floor therapist if you're having nagging hip pain that you want to have treated well.
That's right. That's right. All right. Well, we will continue this conversation, our next episode, which is going to be episode 50. I cannot believe it. And in October, we will have been podcasting for 2 years. How?
That's crazy. It's quite the anniversary.
It is.
Quite the episode anniversary.
That's right. So gosh, this has been so much fun. And it is honestly, Roxy and I always say, this is just a passion project that we have fun doing. So we appreciate everybody listening. So if you enjoy this podcast, please give us a little rating on whatever platform you listen to. But otherwise, we will keep this conversation going. Till next time. Thank you so much for joining us this week on the Pelvis Project podcast. Help us continue the conversation by liking and sharing this episode with friends. And if you really want to do us a solid, leave us a review. If you'd like to follow us on social, check out the show notes for links. And remember, this week, take a deep breath and relax your pelvic floor.